Before we explain what a racially restrictive covenant is, let's first understand covenants. Covenants are legally enforceable contracts forced upon a buyer of a property. Failing to accept these rules, the owner of the property risks forfeiting their property. Covenants are typically run with the land, meaning that they legally bind all future owners to the rules of the covenant. This is a way for a neighborhood to make rules for living in the neighborhood, like having to paint your house a certain way. A racially restrictive covenant is just as it sounds. It restricts the purchase of property or occupation by a specific group of people and was completely enforceable. Not only were these agreements mutually agreed upon by the majority neighborhood holder, but real estate boards and neighborhood associations also enforced them. These agreements were common after the Supreme Court decision Corrigan versus Buckley, which validated their use in 1926. Historically, the most targeted group was African Americans, like the restrictive covenant in Kerrigan versus Buckley. Kerrigan versus Buckley case, the Kerrigan couple living in a racially restrictive neighborhood sold their property knowingly to an African American family, the Curtis family. Kerrigan argued that the covenant deprived the Curtis family of property, while Buckley represented the neighborhood and the racially restrictive covenant, saying that the covenant was legally binding and Kerrigan was in the wrong for breaking the covenant. In this case, the District Supreme Court sided with Buckley, and the case would get appealed to the D.C. Court of Appeals, which once again the court would side with Buckley. Both courts said that Curtis had the same right to create his own racially restrictive covenants in his neighborhood. At this point, the case would get appealed one last time to the Supreme Court, where for a final time would side with Buckley, stating that the Court of Equity will not aid in specific performance of covenants. Later, this would be revisited in 1945, when an African American couple, the Shelley couple, would knowingly buy property protected by a racially restrictive covenant. This case would be known as Shelley versus Kramer. When the case arrived at the 8th Circuit Court, they would rule in favor of the Shelley couple on the grounds that the agreement was haphazardly put together. This case would get appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court. They would rule in the favor of Kramer. Upon reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, the ruling would be once again turned over, stating that no racially restrictive covenants are legal because of the 14th Amendment clause of equal protection. This court deciding, however, did not end racially restrictive covenants, because they could still be established and privately enforced. The end of the racially restrictive covenants would come with the Fair Housing Act of 1986.
In addition to being incredibly racist, these covenants were also economically inefficient as they created areas with inflated values, raising the barrier to entry even further for future prospective tenants. They also created transaction and enforcement costs. Additionally, neighborhoods that people of color, Jewish people, and other discriminated groups like immigrants were forced to move to were many more times likely to be redlined, and thus buyers in the areas would have a much harder time finding home financing that was affordable. They'd have to pay interest that was much higher than what would be reasonable, instead of being able to save that money or place it elsewhere in the economy. Now, in addition to these kind of direct economic costs, there are also many indirect inefficiencies and negative externalities associated with restrictive covenants. The areas not placed under covenants, where people who were discriminated against were pushed to, tended to be in areas of cities that are detrimental to health, such as adjacent to industrial areas or landfills. And this has the effect of reducing health quality, which reduces life expectancy, overall productivity, and quality of life. These covenants have had a lasting effect on the landscape of cities in the United States. Most have large areas left behind because of these restrictions, while other smaller pockets flourish because they had much greater access to financing, better funded schools, and public amenities. It almost feels wrong to discuss them from a purely economic standpoint because the cost in human lives and welfare for over a century has been so high. I didn't want to end the video without discussing the fact that these covenants weren't some abstract concept only practiced in far-off cities. They were real. They were here. There's this map from 1937, a government map of the Kalamazoo area. It has the city divided into over a dozen different sections, shaded with blue, green, yellow, and red, and some lines and cross-hatchings to denote industrial areas and whatnot. This map was made to determine what areas of the city were desirable for living or investment by more affluent white people. Blue signifies areas that had racially restrictive covenants, areas described as stable. They also had segregated schools. Green signifies areas that had highly restrictive covenants. Yellow was used to denote areas without such covenants but had good construction, and was mainly inhabited at this point by people with Dutch or Italian ancestry. Red zones were areas predominantly inhabited by African Americans and other people of color. These areas were poorly constructed, and because of this, as well as their racial makeup, they were redlined. Keeping these things in mind, I drove around Kalamazoo for about 2 hours to capture a time lapse. It's not difficult to see a difference between the areas on the map, even though it's been 85 years since its drawing. I'll show you the 2019 population overlay, and then I'll leave you with the time lapse.